Welcome to another episode of the International School of Temple Arts podcast. I am Simon, apprentice faculty, and I'm here today with one of our faculty members, Bynoi D'Souza. Now, in Bynoi's bio, he writes, I am a global human passionate about supporting humans to use the intelligence of the body to integrate spirituality, sexuality, and science into regular life. Using bottom-up, i.e. body-to-mind communication, sound, micro-movement, and vibration to unwind pain, anxiety, and stress in the body. He writes, I grew up in India and lived there till the age of 23. I've spent the last 15 years facilitating, teaching, and living in Europe, Sweden and Belgium, the UK, Asia, and South America. I'm fascinated by dance and languages and speak 7 languages, including Swedish, Spanish, Hindi, and Sanskrit. Diverse embodied fields, often in source language, classical non-dual Hindu and Tibetan Buddhist Tantric traditions, somatic sexology, trauma-informed neurotransformative practices, nervous and fluid system embodiment, dance, somatic and movement research, shamanic and soul awareness inform my approach, spiral of inquiry, and work. Bynoi, thanks for joining me today.
Good to be here, Simon. Really looking forward to having this conversation with you.
For some reason, the first question I want to ask you is, how are you feeling right now? What is going on in your body?
I'm feeling quite empty. I'm feeling vibration. My body is feeling good, moved, meditated. So feeling in a good place in my body.
Amazing. Is that the way you start every day? Is that kind of like a morning routine kind of deal? When you open your eyes in the morning, do you know what the next 90 minutes of your life will look like? And it involves those practices? How do you approach that?
Certainly movement, vibration, sound, self-pleasure is a part of morning practice, or just practice in general, finding the time. And whenever I do have time and space, which I'm grateful to have, it certainly is a part of my practice. So morning movement is a big part of my day.
One of the things that we talked about potentially discussing during this podcast was a program that you teach called Cultivating Kundalini. Now, I see this a lot in my feed whenever you're about to teach it, and I always feel drawn to it. I'm sure, I hope others do too, who are listening to this podcast. Those programs run, so I'm sure others do. Even if they're not listening to this podcast, they feel drawn to it also. So cultivating Kundalini, I mean, how to approach that? I wonder maybe if you could share with us how you speak about that program and its contents to people who are interested in joining?
Sweet. So yeah, I'm passionate about cultivating life force energy being Kundalini, which is the Sanskrit word for life force energy. And it's also another way to refer to vibration. So I connect different dots with my approach to cultivating life force energy or Kundalini. There is the classical Tantric approach. There's also the somatic approach, somatic meaning of the body, working with the nervous system in the body. And I'm also passionate about working underneath the tone of the nervous system, which in contemporary life I feel is quite valuable, with the fluid systems of the body, and also the energetic or shamanic aspect to working with life force energy. So I connect all three of these dots together when I approach the subject. And sound, working underneath the verbalization or working underneath language. And in this case, we do use certain source tantras meaning referring to books, key texts that human beings have used for more than 1,000 years to educate other humans that were essentially working as educators of Tantra. But working underneath the tone of language, which is verbalization, with vocalization or sounds, key sounds, to access the vibration underneath. So I break it down as underneath verbalization, working with vocalization, and recapitulating or breaking down vocalization or sound itself to access our own authentic vibration. This is one approach. The other approach is working underneath the nervous system, which in itself is a really big area of embodiment that I feel supports human beings to become more aware from body to mind, bottom up, of the ways in which the body can spontaneously sometimes react to input or to stimulus, to become more aware of our own self-defense responses, but also working with our many spontaneous recovery responses in the body. So gaining access to our spontaneous recovery responses that can support us to essentially resource from a different place. And then working with the energetic or shamanic aspects of our own life force energy, working with full body energy orgasmicity, expanding the scope of our pleasure capacity in the body. So bringing together these three aspects, I feel up to this point, we've worked over 3 weeks in a yin way, can support the body itself to open up somatically, to cultivate our life force energy in a different way. So essentially the 3 stages for me are unblocking life force energy, circulating life force energy, and then alchemizing all of what we've unblocked and circulated to essentially be able to create or vibrate our own authentic frequency from body to mind. And there's also a certain level of working with the mind that's required, that we go into using meditative practices and meditation, but essentially spending more time in the body itself, which is essentially our own subconscious, supporting us to become aware of all of what's stored in the subconscious, which anyway is a much greater indicator or a much greater place for us to have impact on our own embodiment, on our own which we perceive reality, or supporting us to strip some of the layers through which we're perceiving reality at the moment to vibrate differently. I can go on, but
Oh, wow. Yeah. I would love you to go on. There are so many things in there that you've articulated that resonate for me, and that seem to, just the way that you phrased some concepts or ideas or practices, the way that you phrased them seem to contain a lot of information. So I've got questions, and I really would love for you to just continue. But maybe one of the questions I have in what you've just said is about this idea of going underneath. So you talk about going bottom up, this idea of like coming to the body rather than going by default to the mind, or rather than accessing the body through the mind, like starting with the body. So there's that aspect of working underneath, but you also said working underneath the nervous system. And also there was something about underneath language. Well, I wonder if you could say more about that. Like, how do you work underneath the nervous system? What does, for example?
So a very simple way to approach the nervous system is in many ways the way in which we perceive reality. We are aware of what it is that we're doing, both what we are, our actions, which is the motor part of our nervous system, and also what we're sensing within, which is the sensory part of our nervous system. This is a very simple breakdown. And our nervous system can support us to have greater awareness of our actions, both what we're doing outside and what we're sensing inside. Having greater degrees of that awareness while being connected with ourselves first before we begin to relate with another or a group or our general environment can only support us to essentially have greater awareness of what it is that we're doing. Now, to a certain degree, that's a very valid perspective and that's helpful. However, what I notice happening with a lot of human beings is that our nervous systems themselves are fried, or our nervous systems themselves can get overwhelmed with the intensity of life, with outer circumstances, inner circumstances, or just embodiment itself of our own nervous system can be a challenge. So firstly, beginning to be able to embody different parts of our own nervous system can be a good starting point, to have a better reference point of what it can feel like to be connected or aware of our own nervous system. So that can be a starting point. And also then, as we approach awareness from body to mind, I like to use the embryological model of development, which means as we begin life, and the dance of life begins when sperm meets egg, and then we float for about 9 months in the fluid home of our embryos in our biological parent or mother's womb. Our nervous system develops itself much later. What we are essentially is fluid. And then we have a nervous system that develops a couple of weeks later, and then we develop a vertebra, and then language comes in at about 3 years old. So the greater our degree or capacity is to be able to recapitulate, go much, much earlier into our early childhood experiences, which in many ways, subconsciously, is still in the background of many human beings' experiences. And depending upon what's happening right now in many people's lives, can also be a big factor controlling or manipulating or directing in unconscious or subconscious ways their experiences of life at work, in intimate relationships, in groups. It can support to be able to go back to repattern some of those experiences themselves. So essentially, the fluid system, and this is just one way of looking at it when we approach reality from body to mind, we first have a fluid system. We're floating in fluid, and our nervous system develops much later. So from this perspective, the nervous system can be viewed as a recorder. And once it records a pattern or a habit, it can sometimes be the first to claim credit for recording that pattern or habit. But the original conductor or the original originator is fluid, is our fluid system. So when we want to dissolve or repattern some of our life experiences or some of the ways in which we're presently experiencing reality, it can also support to be able to, in an embodied way, go back into our own fluid. And by fluid, I mean the many different fluids in our bodies: blood, lymphatic fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, to then have a different experience of reality. So that's what I mean by working underneath the tone of our nervous system through our fluid system. And that, in short, is what I meant by working underneath the tone of our nervous system with the fluid system of the body.
I wouldn't be surprised if this idea feels new to some people, of going into our fluid systems. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you support people to do that, maybe practically, or how do you support people to make this journey back into their fluid systems?
Beautiful question. Essentially accessing, working underneath the tone of our nervous system, which is going back into the time during which we were floating in the embryo and working with certain parts of the body that have direct connections with those early embryological places. This means working a lot with the belly, also working with the gums and the teeth and the tongue, working with these very early connections, how we essentially became embodied when we were in the womb was through movement, degrees of spontaneous movement in the womb. If you look at a video of development that's staged of the movements of an embryo in the womb, there's a high degree of spontaneous movement that babies make in the womb. And electrical impulses are literally sent by the muscles, by the proprioceptors, and the brain forms a map of the body. And then through early childhood experiences and the experiences of growing up, we lose some of that embodiment. So recovering spontaneous movement of the body, where the body is responding without necessarily parts of the mind coming into the picture, can take time, can be can require a certain degree of patience, but I see it happening. So that's one way. The other way is there are certain very old connections directly in the body to the fluid system, through the belly, through the mouth, places where we have a lot of neurons, a lot of sensitivity, and resensitizing the body back to this place can support to access some of that. The work of somatic pioneers, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, Emily Conrad, their work in somatic research, and also work of sacred dances, and also classical Tantra, actually, for me, connect the dots back into this place of spontaneous movement, and also underneath the tone of our nervous system back into the fluid system of the body. When we're working with full body energy orgasmicity, we're also working with the fluid system of the body. Arousal, in many ways, our pleasure capacity is also directly connected with the movement of fluid in the body. So there are many different gateways into the fluid system of the body. And for some human beings, some gateways, some parts work, some don't. For some human beings, all of them work. Many of them, they begin in one place, and then once they open up some somatic pathways, many others open up too. So I notice different pathways working for different human beings, which is why I also tend to use many different ways to approach the embodiment of the fluid system in the body. And this can be a stretch goal for some people. So beginning with the embodiment of the nervous system itself, breath is a really beautiful way to begin to access the fluid system of the body. I use certain embryological breaths that are also present in different traditions, and they have different names. The way in which we used to breathe when we were an embryo in the body, to support people to embody the fluid system in the body. So a couple of different ways that I use to support greater embodiment.
Yeah, well, I wonder, I love something that's resonating for me. One of the many things is this idea of access points in the body. And it's associated with the spontaneous movement in the womb, and which parts of the body are earliest to develop, physicalize, and that they are still existent for us as kind of access points to go back. So in light of that, I wonder if you could expand a little bit on what you call orgasmicity and pleasure points on the body. Maybe that involves expanding on the genitals as well. Maybe it's clusters of nerve endings. Yeah, how does, could you say a little bit more about how that aspect of things fits into this system, non-system?
I guess I'd like to separate a few things here. So when I mentioned orgasmicity, essentially it's a word that I'm using to refer to our capacity to feel, to experience sensation, or to experience the frequency of what people sometimes experience as orgasm in their genitals, in all parts of their body. So every cell of our body potentially has the capacity to vibrate at the frequency of what people may or may not have experienced only in their genitals. And since this is a frequency, by essentially supporting our body itself to expand the places in which we experience sensation, in which we experience, maybe for some human beings, it's pleasure, or for some human beings, what comes up is the lack of sensation. Essentially, orgasmicity refers to the capacity to experience this frequency in all parts of our body, in all cells of our body have the capacity to vibrate. So if vibrating in our heart, that could be a heartgasm. If we're experiencing that in our eye, it could be an eyegasm. If we're crying at that moment, it could be a crygasm. And for me, it's also quite directly connected with our capacity to experience our emotions or our emotionality. So our emotionality, or our capacity to experience or support ourselves to circulate our energy in motion, is quite directly connected with our capacity for orgasmicity. So that was orgasmicity in short. And for me, it's not just in our genitals, though there's always deeper places in which we can support sensation, support ourselves to experience the frequency of orgasm in different places. Another place that I'd like to take that into, which is oftentimes the words orgasm and ejaculation, especially for people that identify as being male, are confused. But essentially, an orgasm doesn't necessarily have to end in an ejaculation. An orgasm can continue to vibrate. An orgasm can continue to be this continuous flow, the surfing of energy itself. So for human beings that want to experience the full range of their own orgasmicity, it can support to essentially begin to explore this other way, this non-linear way of approaching their own sensation, sexuality, emotionality, orgasmicity. And for me, quite directly connected with that is our pleasure capacity. And by pleasure points or somatic openings in the body, I feel for many human beings, the way in which they experience pleasure itself is indirect. By that, I mean a stimulus is outside. It could be another human being. It could be something on a screen. It could be something external, which is beautiful and has its place. But if that's the only way in which we're experiencing pleasure, we're blocking this direct route of pleasure. So literally speaking, our hands, our genitals, and our gums and mouth and tip of our tongue have the most neural openings or neurons or capacity to experience sensation and pleasure in the body. So these are direct access points where essentially if I'm touching something by my hands and I can expanding the sensation in my gums and my teeth and my tongue or my genitals, there are direct highways, nerve pathways going to the brain that support my brain to generate a cocktail of chemicals, oxytocin, serotonin. So if I have both of these pathways open, or if I have the direct route of pleasure open and I have the capacity to experience pleasure indirectly, I essentially have the capacity to, or human beings have the capacity to experience a greater range of pleasure. Human beings, I observe, live in a very narrow band, very narrow capacity range of what they allow themselves to experience, whether that's pleasure, whether that's emotionality. So we're essentially working with this range and expanding this range of sensation, of capacity, of pleasure by going into the body and supporting different somatic gateways, somatic pathways to open up continuously over a period of time.
Yeah, amazing. I think a lot of people would be able to identify with that idea that of requiring external stimuli for their pleasure. And what I'm interpreting, I guess, or how I'm receiving what you're saying, is that one of the ways that we can expand our pleasure spectrum like a great deal is to be able to feel inside of us, like to be able to feel our own system instead of it needing the external input. Yeah. And maybe you've already said this, but how do I do that? How do I feel myself? I'm so used to watching something or reading something or having someone do something to me as my reference. I'm so used to that as my reference point that I feel like when I want to experience pleasure, I need more of that. When it's not there, I don't experience it. So how do I begin to have myself as my own input?
Great question. Yeah. Essentially beginning to be able to feel sensation through the hands, through the gums and the mouth, on the genitals, essentially staying or beginning to connect with our own capacity to feel with ourselves first. The greater that capacity is, or if we're aware that we're totally disconnected from our ability or capacity to feel our own hands, our own genitals, our own, beginning to reawaken those pathways. So there are simple exercises that we can begin to do to support human beings to have a sense of what that can feel like, to essentially begin to take from our own body, or to be able to feel our own skin, wake up our own hands, can be a quick way to begin to develop awareness of whether we have embodiment of those pathways or not. And then there are many other ways in which we can begin to embody our own connection with ourselves, our capacity to, once we have a certain awareness or embodiment of our own hands, our own mouth, gums, teeth, genitals, skin, and we're comfortable immersing or marinating in our own touch, which is why our capacity to immerse in our own touch or self-touch without external stimuli can be a really beautiful tool, really beautiful practice to deepen our connection with ourselves. The greater our capacity is then when we choose to engage with someone outside, one or another, to then even begin to feel our own skin and to get a greater sense of what it is that we may even want or desire, or what it is that our body may respond to or want in a different way. So essentially, if the direct route of sensation or pleasure is not present, and our only way to support ourselves to feel or have sensation or be aroused is indirectly, then we've blocked a large portion of our pleasure capacity or sensation capacity. So a quick way to begin to reawaken that is to begin to reawaken this very direct connection to pleasure or sensation. Self-pleasure can be a really beautiful tool. Reconnecting with our own touch without needing to resort to external stimuli or fantasy. And all of that has its place. There's no judgment about any of that. Sounding, reconnecting with our capacity, our body's capacity to literally vibrate with sound, And then micro movement, supporting our body to receive our own stimulus through sound or movement or breath. And breath is an incredible medicine for ourselves, the original plant medicine, as to support ourselves, to shift literally our state. Also in our own nervous system, to shift states, to be able to begin to experience different states or take ourselves into different states in the body. Can be quick ways to begin to develop or reconnect with this more direct root of pleasure and sensation and touch. So the more time we spend marinating or taking ourselves, being able to take ourselves to different states of sensation or pleasure, or the greater our capacity is when we choose then to, from that place of being connected with ourselves first, to choose to engage with another.
Thank you. Yeah. I want to keep swimming in this. This is so beautiful. I've got questions about sound. You articulated sound in such a beautiful way. Like the idea that something along the lines of something in what you said was, it can be about finding each person's own unique resonance or unique sound that really connects to them. Is that accurate?
So what I was referring to there was a way in which I support people to experience vibration, because oftentimes to many people, vibration can be quite abstract, can be quite an abstract concept or something outside. But to experience vibration from the inside out, or literally to begin to vibrate the vessel of their own body, or the cathedral of sound that is our own temple of our own body, it can support to, underneath verbalization or words or language, to begin to explore vocalization or certain key sounds underneath which lie vibration itself. So when human beings, and oftentimes with sound, it's the perception of that can be something that happens where sound is going outside. So it can be associated with singing, or it can be associated with singing in a particular way, or with needing to sound in a particular way that sounds good, or whatever the perception can be. But sound can also be sounding into our bodies, or sounding from particular places in our body. So awakening that capacity itself can begin to support human beings to experience their vibration from a different place. And there's a very old connection between our voice and our genitals. Very old embryological highways that essentially connect between our genitals and our voice. Our voice is an erotic organ. So the more we can support ourselves to embody our own sound, our own voice in a different way, the more we're supporting ourselves to embody our own authentic vibration differently. So I notice in many embodied circles of inquiry, whether it's a yoga class or whether it's a movement class, there's very little sound happening unless it's asked of people to sound in a particular way. But beginning to work with our own emotional body, where sounding is a big part of supporting ourselves to vibrate our emotional bodies, to clear our emotional bodies, which also supports ourselves to begin to embody our own energetic bodies, can support us to begin to feel this vibration from a different place, which is inside out. So the concept, or that I sometimes use in short, is underneath verbalization exists vocalization, underneath which exists vibration. And that for me also connects back to quite a classical tantric way of approaching vibration in the body, which is something that I'm passionate about. So sound is one gateway. There can be breath that can support access into vibration. Also supporting our bodies to receive an impulse, and then allowing or giving our bodies time to unwind to that impulse through micro movement, which can be a little bit of a stretch goal, but for beings that are more advanced practitioners, it can also support. So essentially what we're doing is staying with our subconscious, staying with our body, and expanding the capacity of our body to respond to an impulse, which is a training ground for life itself. Expanding the gap between receiving an impulse or stimulus and our response, instead of a patterned reaction or a habitual reaction.
Yeah. So imagine there's this element of spontaneity that you mentioned before that comes in, and like welcoming spontaneous responses that are felt. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in some ways, or in many ways, beginning to invest in more ways in which we essentially have access to our own spontaneous recovery responses as a tool to support us to resource from the life force or from the wellspring of our own life force energy. So yes, life can be quite intense. We have, human beings have their own self-defense responses of fight or freeze or anxiety or stress that come up. But the more we begin to cultivate our own recovery responses, spontaneous recovery responses through sounding, through beginning to explore different ways of accessing breath, of touch, spontaneous movement, the more we're supporting our bodies to essentially resource, develop resilience from a different place. So we're supporting ourselves to bounce back from life events that can range from micro intensity to micro traumatic, to trauma with a small t, to trauma with a big T. We're supporting the capacity of our own bodies to bounce back or develop resilience from bottom up, from body to mind. And that takes time, and that takes cultivation, and that takes practice. But it's an ongoing journey, and getting fascinated, developing wonder, getting lost in our own spontaneous responses. So more and more I see beings that have developed this capacity. It's more, you don't know what the next response of your body is. And it's also losing self-consciousness, losing politeness, because none of this looks civilized. So spontaneous responses aren't necessarily civilized. So I like to connect this back to also parts of our brain when I approach this using science. And we're working with really old parts of our brain. So I use quite a simple model, which is the triune model of the brain that neuroscientist came up with in the 1960s, called Paul MacLean. But I work with the embodiment of our brain itself and connecting those parts of our brain back to our body, or bringing online parts underneath the prefrontal cortex, which is the part where language and words exist, going underneath that into the limbic system, which is more our emotionality and our animal body and our spontaneous animal instincts, or sometimes defense responses exist. But underneath that itself, within our reptilian brain, it's a very old bandwidth, a very old part of ourselves that we share with all mammals on this planet. So we human beings are essentially the reptiles that crawled out of water, laid our eggs on land, and broke out of those shells and then began to crawl, going back many millions of years. This is another way in which we share, like through the fluid system, resonance with like the fluid in our body, the same fluid that holds us in the womb. The amniotic fluid is the same material that reptiles use to build, or the shells of reptiles are built out of or are made out of. And there's a resonance between the fluid in our body, the fluid in the planet, and the fluid in the galaxy. It's a different kind of resonance, but there is a resonance. So fluid is a very resonant element.
Mm.
So there are interconnections between the fluid system, between parts of the brain, between other mammals on this planet or beings that we share our planet with, and resonance itself. It's a different way to experience our interdependence with community, with nature, with our nature, very primordial stream of consciousness.
As we work towards a close of this podcast, I feel like there's so much opened up that we could explore. I wanted to ask about, let me say, your experience as a global being, someone who's grown up in one place, spent significant time in other places, and yeah, you mentioned fluidity, going together with a kind of community and interdependence. You also use this, articulate things as like connecting the dots. I kind of visualize your journey around this planet as kind of connecting dots in a way. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about your experience as a global person. A global being. Why has that been your path, and how do you think or feel that it's informed your teaching now?
So I guess I've had the experience of growing up in India. I've spent a significant amount of time living in Sweden, in Belgium and South America and the UK, and also speaking different languages. So to me, it's always fascinating how concepts that exist in one language don't quite exist in another. So the ways in which human beings themselves express themselves is so different. And also dance. For me, spent quite a lot of time teaching dance, working with communities in dance. And both of those expressions, language and dance, and speaking different languages and dancing and teaching and creating communities with different dances, for me, they're places where essentially different ways to explore or to actually feel our own interdependence, where human beings are more similar than different, irrespective of concepts, irrespective of, there's so many ways in which we could choose to feel our own separation, and cultures have their own beauty. For me, I've been blessed to experience cultures from the inside out. And I guess my journey is one of being able to draw upon many of these different threads of experiences in the body, of different ways to communicate through the body. There's a certain richness that I've been blessed to experience across language, across tradition. And all of that certainly informs how I choose to share what I share in the world, approaching things from the body itself, which is a more direct way to speak to people sometimes doesn't require language. The language can then come later, and it can be quite confronting to experience things in such a primal way or in such a primordial way, where the language then comes much later. Or sometimes for some human beings, it does require a certain shift in mindset or a certain shift in the mind before there's a willingness in the body. And more I'm learning to do it both ways. But it certainly shaped how I choose to share myself in the world. And I also facilitate events in Spanish, and just notice the beauty of, in different languages, how people respond so differently to certain frequencies of emotions or certain ways of emotionality. Sometimes it can be patterned. So breaking the boundaries of language itself and then working with the body can be a beautiful way too to disrupt patterns. But I'm certainly grateful for exposure to different languages where sometimes certain concepts don't exist at all. To be able to share myself or to support human beings to have greater degrees of connection, their own connection with themselves and their own sexuality and their own direct connection to experiencing states of sensation or pleasure or spirituality in their own bodies. Shorn of any dogma or tradition, or then if they choose to explore deeper layers of certain tradition, very grateful to support them to do so.
I feel like it feels like a nice place for us to leave things this time around. Before we finish, if there's anything that you want to share with people listening to this podcast that maybe we haven't had a moment to speak on so far, is there anything that's bubbling or some kind of message, an inquiry you might want to invite people into? Or
I guess getting curious with staying with the body, getting curious with the capacity to just stay with the purity of response of their own bodies, whether it's through simple ways to meditate or through movement or through sound, or then expanding that capacity. If there is access to or breath, and beginning to develop each of those individually can be very potent ways to essentially continue to access our own subconscious, which is, for me, the body, in many different ways. And to stay with the subconscious in many different ways can support a much greater impact on our own embodiment or their own embodiment, which essentially can support to human beings to bring out their own authentic vibration or voice from a more authentic place, to embody their own vibration or voice can be beneficial, I guess, is what I'm feeling to share right now. To get curious, essentially, fascinated even as a stretch, wonder, the capacity of our own body to immerse or to marinate in our own embodiment, to get potentially even the states of wonder where we're observing our own responses, can be a really beautiful, generative, beneficial journey. And I guess that's my hope or my wish, I guess. My invitation is for beings to choose to get curious about this capacity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And before we get to some quick fire questions, if you're up for that, how can people get in contact with you or learn more about what you offer?
Great question. My website, lovemovementevolution.com, Instagram, which I'm sure we could add in the podcast, ways to connect with me, and my newsletter. I guess my newsletter is the simplest way for people to get in contact, or my website.
Amazing. So they can sign up for the newsletter at your website, I imagine.
Absolutely, through the contact form on my website. But my website, my newsletter, and Instagram.
And you're teaching over the northern summer, I imagine?
Yes, I am. I'm going to be in Ireland, going to be co-facilitating the ista level 1s in a couple of places in Ireland, in Italy, and also the ista level 1 in Spanish in Colombia.
Ooh, amazing. That's so exciting.
Few of the events that I'm involved with, and I would love to share this journey with you if any of you feel called.
Mm-hmm. Okay, are you up for some quick fire questions?
Absolutely.
So in 3 words or less, if you were a piece of furniture, what would you be?
Today, a chair.
What did you have for dinner last night?
Tacos.
When is your favorite time to make love?
Mornings, afternoons, evenings. Mornings and evenings.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee and tea.
A maximalist. Okay. What fragrance do you wear?
I actually make my own essential oils. So I love mixing my own essential oils, and it's been something that I've been drawn to for a while.
Where is your happy place on this earth?
I have a few different happy places. They're always in nature. Oceans, a forest, beach. I have a few different happy places. Trees, nature.
Beautiful. Bynoi, thanks so much for being with us today.
Simon, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much. Really grateful for the opportunity to connect with all of the beings listening to me today. And thank you for listening to me.
You're most welcome. It's been my pleasure. Thanks for listening to the Spiritual, Sexual, Shamanic podcast. To find out more about ISTA's retreats, online festivals, or to work with our faculty, visit our website, ista.life, or find us on Facebook at ista.life and on Instagram at ista_tribe.